all of you have already, I believe, covered this topic in microbiology. So introduction has been given to you on what this disease is all about, and you must have heard it in the from other sources also, the basics of this disease. Uh, so we need to exactly is this is basically it is a HIV uh, RNA virus, and the enzyme reverse transcriptase makes the DNA copy following the penetration. These are all things which must have been covered. Uh, so I'll not go into the details. Basically, it is a virus which infects new cells, and this leads to a gradual reduction in the CD4 cells. So CD4 cells is the most important cell during in the whole of the infection, because it is a cell of the immune system which gets affected by the infection by HIV virus, and there is a gradual reduction of the CD4 cells, leading to immune system failure, which leads to opportunistic infection and secondary malignancies, which we will study in the next lecture. So these helper CD4 cells get depleted and the cytotoxic CD8 cells are generated. So there is a consistent fall in the CD4 cell counts and increase in the CD8 cell counts. It is by monitoring the CD4 cells that we are able to monitor the degree of infection and the stage of the disease. This we will cover in the later part of the lecture. So we have low CD4 count in peripheral blood cells, a reduced response to various kinds of antigens, decrease in cell-mediated immunity. This is important. That is why there is an increase in incidence of tuberculosis and fungal infection, because it is a cell-mediated immunity which is primarily infected. Increase in immunoglobulins and defective phagocytosis. These are the immunological abnormalities which are seen. Transmission is by sexual intercourse. Homosexual as well as heterosexual is most common, although somehow the homosexual has been more given more prominence, but most commonly it is by heterosexual transmission. Blood products, occupation, like those who are exposed to blood and blood products, and placental transmission, that is from mother to child. Most common sexual transmission is heterosexual over the globe, and the virus transmits through the seminal fluid and the vaginal cells. Blood products transmission risk is highest and very quick, almost 80 to 90% risk of transmission by blood. That's why Government of India, or the whole world, in fact, has started the program of monitoring the blood. All the blood which is donated and before it is transfused to anyone is checked for HIV viruses. And now, as of now, we can say that this mode of transmission is almost negligible in our countries. Wherever there is a regular registered blood banks who are following all the guidelines, there the risk of transmitting HIV through blood transfusion is almost negligible in our country. IV drug addicts continue to be a very important source because of use of old syringes and sharing of syringes, and use of unsterilized syringes continues to be common. Occupational hazards, as we health workers are always at risk. The risk is less, around 0.3%. Abraded skin, if you see, because if you have an intact skin and on which a drop of blood falls from an HIV infected patient, there is no risk of transmission of HIV. But if the skin is abraded, and then there is a risk that the virus might get transmitted to us. Doctor to patient, obviously not possible, not transmitted by clothes, saliva, insects, or casual touch. So if you shake hands or while examining the patient, if you happen to touch the patient with HIV, the risk is almost zero. So you can very easily, comfortably examine the patients. But when you think that you are coming in, have to come in contact with the fluids, body fluids, their wearing of gloves, which are called as universal precautions, has to be followed. So because it is the fluids, and suppose there is a minor abrasion on your hands which you are not aware of, and then there is some contact with this, so then there is a chance. So following of universal precaution, that is wearing of gloves always while handling the fluids, body fluids of a patient, and is very important. Maternal fetal transmission is common during the second trimester. The transmission is comparatively less with a cesarean section when the surgery is done to deliver the baby. Postnatal, the risk is very high. Breastfeeding, the risk is 15 to 45%. Despite this, it is always encouraged that the mother should feed their child who are born to HIV positive mothers, because that is a good source of this thing, protein for the child. And it has been found that by use of various drugs, this risk can be reduced now. Some HIV is not transmitted by, which is very important to know for us, is by not by mosquitoes, which are very common in our country, food, water, toilet seats, swimming pools, handshakes, clothes, sweats and tears, and by kissing. HIV is not transmitted. Clinically, HIV should be viewed as a spectrum ranging from primary infection, which may be absolutely asymptomatic, to advanced stage. I apologize for certain mistakes in the slides which have crept in because it was done at a very short notice. It can produce any kind of symptom, and it involves various systems. So the disease spectrum starts from group 1 symptoms, which is the incubation period. Group 2 is the asymptomatic cases. Group 3 is persistent generalized lymphadenopathy and symptomatic cases. This is when the symptoms start and when the patient comes to clinical, to the medical profession, and we are able to diagnose. For the first two groups, with the incubation period asymptomatic, obviously they will not come to the doctor, so they will not be. Randomly, they might get tested for HIV during a pre-health checkups or during blood screening, and they might be picked up. So it is usually the group 3 or group 4 sometimes where the patients are diagnosed and they come into the health setup. This you can see as the infection happens here. This is the phase where the seroconversion, which is called as the patient's antibody levels start, the antigen starts spreading in the body, and as you see the time frame from the first 4 to 8 weeks, there are no symptoms, and obviously there are no antibodies also. So after this 8 weeks time, which is the incubation period time, so then this is the phase which starts from here and goes on to have minor or no symptoms. This phase lasts for 12 years. So up to 12 years, the person who has been infected with HIV may have no symptoms, and this is the phase where he is infective also, and he is able to infect people without even knowing that he's. So this is the asymptomatic phase, as you can see in the top, and then the pre-HIV, and then the full-blown AIDS when the CD4 counts have fallen below a particular level. So this asymptomatic phase can last up to 12 years. And it, sometimes, depending upon the age of the patient, the comorbidities which he is suffering from, and if he develops any opportunistic infection during this time. So a young, healthy, or a other not suffering from any other illness may remain asymptomatic or with just minor symptoms for almost 12 years. This is the challenge with this disease, that a person may be infective to the community, people around him, and he may himself have no symptoms. That is why it is stressed that regular checkup should be done in high-risk population, where the risk of catching HIV infection is high. So this graph will explain you the long asymptomatic phase, which is there in the disease. You can see on the top, with minor and no symptoms. and and by the end of this, obviously the antibodies are not effective in controlling the disease. And it is in this stage that the generalized lymphadenopathy, fever, and weight loss will start happening. And full-blown AIDS is considered when opportunistic infection or malignancy start coming into the picture. That is what is called as AIDS. Otherwise, it is called as HIV. Incubation period is classically 8 to 12 weeks. There is intense viremia. Antibodies against virus are not detectable. So viremia means the virus is replicating in the body. The antigen is replicating, but antibodies are not detectable during this incubation, and ELISA test is negative. So during this incubation period, ELISA test will be negative. Asymptomatic period, as I said, is may present as a acute viral syndrome after 3 to 4. Acute viral syndrome means like any other viral illness like sore throat, cough, myalgia, low grade, low to moderate grade fever. This is after 3 to 4 weeks of coming into contact or getting infected the person. So this will obviously, this person goes to a doctor saying that I'm suffering from these symptoms of cough, cold, body ache, myalgia, sore throat, fever, or any other things. So they will obviously not be testing him for HIV. And even if they test him at this time with a routine test, they will not be detected. So after the subsidence, this is the phase of intense viremia, this acute viral syndrome, and it stops after 2 to 3 weeks. This may not happen in all patients. It may happen in some, but it happens in most of them. And then the CD4 count starts reducing. So obviously, majority of the patients are not detected during this phase because this phase has non-specific symptoms. The tests which we are employing to detect ELISA is not positive, and it recovers. The patient becomes asymptomatic after the period, and then comes the and this asymptomatic stage, as I said, may remain for 10 to 12 years. Progression depends upon the level of RNA levels, which can be monitored. CD4 cell level starts falling at the rate of 50 cells per year. So after 10 years, the normal CD4 cell count, which is around 500 per microliter of blood, may become around, say, 50 cells per year. So you may have around 200 cells after a gap of few years, and then they are said to become the carriers. So this is this asymptomatic phase, which is very, very critical if we want to control the disease. Because if we are able to detect these asymptomatic cases, nowadays treatment is being offered even to asymptomatic cases, all these cases. Earlier it was said that we offer treatment only to those who have CD4 count levels below 250. But now for the last 2 years, the policy has changed and it says that we have to offer treatment to all HIV positive cases, and we have to give them, offer them treatment, the antiretroviral treatment. So it is found that if we give antiretroviral treatment to even asymptomatic cases, we can prolong their life, we can delay the onset of opportunistic infections, and obviously improve the quality of life also, and the number of years they can live without any major morbidity also. So the target is to to detect maximum patients during this asymptomatic phase. So this is the grade 3 where the symptomatic stages, where the symptom starts. They don't have any AIDS defining condition. They are immunosuppressed. CD4 cell count is decreased. Viral load is increased. And ELISA test comes positive. The most important thing here is that the ELISA test has come positive. And the patient may start developing certain non-specific symptoms, low-grade fever, weight loss, and something. But still, the AIDS-defining conditions are not there. Now, what are the clinical features of this symptomatic phase? Is fatigue, fever, weight loss, diarrhea. They may present as meningitis, lymphadenopathy, which is not explainable by any other diagnosis like tuberculosis or malignancies. Oral candidiasis. This is a type of fungal infection which happens in the oral cavity. Hairy leukoplegia, herpes. These are all features which are seen in once the patient of AIDS becomes symptomatic. Before, these are full-blown cases of AIDS. They are prone to opportunistic infections. This opportunistic infection we will be covering in the next lecture. So at present we can just name them. CD4 count starts falling and it is usually below 200. So when the CD4 cell count starts falling below 200, that is when most of the patients come to clinical picture is full-blown, and we are able to diagnose most of them. Viral load obviously is high, ELISA is positive, and the prognosis becomes poor at this stage because the patient has already developed opportunistic infections. So we have to treat him not only for the HIV but also for the opportunistic infections. So use of multiple drugs leads to various kinds of side effects. It deteriorates the quality of life, and obviously the survival is poor. This is again talking about the opportunistic infection, which we will be talking in the next lecture. So I will not give much of uh, tuberculosis is increased because of decrease in cell-mediated immunity. Reactivation of old lesions can happen. So tuberculosis is one of the most important infection which patients of AIDS can present with. So it has now become a standard rule that all patients presenting with tuberculosis should be tested for HIV. As I said, that it is the cell-mediated immunity which is reduced in the patients with HIV, and that leads to increased incidence of tuberculosis. There may be reactivation of old lesion. There may be atypical features like instead of having a cavitatory upper zone lesions, we may have it in the middle zone, lower zone, and it may be interstitial kind of picture. It may not be a classical cavitatory findings. Diagnosis is difficult because classical symptoms like sputum production is less, and the positivity rate in sputum is also difficult. Prognosis obviously is poor. Multi-drug resistance to the anti-tubercular drugs is common. So these are all the challenges which patient of tuberculosis who also has HIV faces. These are all the features which we see. So it may be difficult to diagnose this patient of tuberculosis because of various reasons. Fungal infections are very common. As I said, oral candidiasis, which may lead to dysphagia. So patient presenting with tuberculosis, patient may presenting with dysphagia. And if you examine the oral cavity, you can see the white colored patches inside. I'll show you the picture a little later. Skin infections are very common. This is oral candidiasis picture. If you can see the tongue, and you can see the white curdy-like appearance on the tongue. This is the typical look appearance of oral candidiasis. So any patient coming to us with oral candidiasis, it is very important that we get in check for HIV, because oral candidiasis is one of the most common presentation of HIV. This is again oral candidiasis. From the side you can see white colored spots, patches over here in the inside of the oral cavity. Again, a curdy-like appearance. It looks as if the patient has consumed milk or curd just a short time back. So this is oral candidiasis for you. Again, a different picture of oral candidiasis, making much more clear what it looks like inside the oral cavity. At this stage, most of the patients will not have any fever or something. They may just have a little bit of weight loss. But if you see any patient with this kind of picture, this kind of presentation, it is very essential that if he has not been tested for AIDS, you should test him for HIV testing. This is oral candidiasis for you. The purpose of this lecture is basically to, since we are not having clinical classes these days, to show you these pictures so you can get some idea about kind of this thing. Gastrointestinal diseases like weight loss, hairy leukoplakia, small bowel disease, and various other types of presentation. This is a hairy leukoplakia. You can see a side of the tongue. It is looking like oral. You can see it's a kind of a long patch which is seen here. Obviously, it can be best appreciated when you see the patient yourself. Picture can't give you such a good idea, but it is usually a lesion of the oral cavity. This is again one of the classical features of HIV. So any patient with oral leukopenia should always be examined, tested for HIV. White warty-like projection of the lateral surface of the tongue and cheek. So unless you examine the lateral surface of the tongue, you may miss it. It is usually painless, and treatment is acyclovir, which obviously we will be covering a little later. So hairy leukoplakia and oral candidiasis, we have common presentation of herpes infection. Again, a very common mode of presentation of symptomatic HIV. Dermatomes, you can see various kind of skin lesions which are seen in a particular dermatome. It is usually unilateral, painful infections. It may become disseminated. Again, this is an extensive herpes. If you can see this picture, this you can see that the left leg is not involved, but the right leg is completely involved. This is a L3, L4, L5 dermatome is getting affected here, and the left side is completely normal. This is a dermatable pattern. This is usually unilateral in patient with herpes. So this is again a common mode of presentation of herpes. This is again a very common typical skin presentation. Blisters can be seen on the skin, which are common of herpes zoster. So oral hairy leukoplakia, oral candidiasis, herpes zoster, tuberculosis, common skin diseases which can be present with HIV is seborrheic dermatitis, folliculitis. This is very, very common. But when you start coming to the clinics and come to the wards, you will find that almost every patient or second patient of AIDS has one or other of these skin involvement. Seborrheic dermatitis is one of the commonest. This is what you see, seborrheic dermatitis. This is the hair of the person, and you can see this white colored patches seen here. And this is how the hair will look like in a patient with seborrheic dermatitis. Again, in the feet, seborrheic dermatitis. Firstly, you'll see them molluscum lesions. These are small water drop like lesions. You can see there's a center, there's a clearing, and in surrounding you can see small blister-like presentation. Again, a molluscum lesion, molluscum contagiosum it is called. Tinea cruris, a common fungal infection, but in a patient with HIV it is usually very, very extensive. It is not limited only to the groin, it is spread below to the thighs and up to almost a knee level. Tinea cruris. So this is again a skin presentation. Fungal infection in the hands. Obviously, these are very common infections in people who are not having HIV. But when you see an extensive lesion, which is involving a whole of the hand and all of the limb, then definitely we should suspect that the patient may be having HIV. This is a drug rash, which is very, very common because of various drugs which we are using. One of the commonest drugs which we use in HIV is cotrimoxazole, and it has a very high propensity of high risk of causing skin rash. So this is a typical picture of what a drug rash looks like. So patient may present with this symptom, drug-induced eruptions. A normal person without HIV, if he takes these drugs, the chances of having a skin reaction is lesser. But a person with HIV, when he takes these drugs, the risk of having skin reactions are higher. Sinus encephalopathy, sinus involvement, they may present with encephalopathy. Again, meningitis is quite common. Myelopathy, involvement of the spinal cord, peripheral neuropathy, involvement of the peripheral nerves, brain abscess and all things. These things are still not within your. Obviously, these are not clinical features of HIV, but they may present with, once they are diagnosed with HIV and someone tells them that you have HIV positive, obviously they go into depression, they may develop guilt, anxiety, anger, panic attacks, behavioral abnormalities, and then later on, AIDS, dementia complex, and acute psychosis. Nephropathy is a common involvement in the later stages, obviously not in early stages. And then almost all the organs, if you see, the Addison's disease is involving the adrenals, heart, the pericardium, the muscles, the glomerulus of the kidney. So there is no organ which is spared. These kind of neoplasms are very, very common in a diagnostic. Kaposi sarcoma is a classical and very typical of HIV, but not seen so commonly in our country. Various kind of malignancies like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, oral and rectal squamous cell carcinoma, and lymphoma of the brain are also seen. Kaposi sarcoma was endemic in Africa at one time in the early stages. Usually seen in elderly Eastern European people. Not so common in our country, but we do get cases. This is a photograph which shows you, or I myself have just seen one case of Kaposi sarcoma. So it is not so common in our country. This is again a picture of Kaposi sarcoma patches. This is again full body picture which you can see Kaposi sarcoma. How to diagnose HIV? The final few slides. ELISA is the initial test which we do whenever we suspect any person to have HIV. We send him for testing. There are specific AIDS testing centers which have been designated in our own college. We have it in the. If you go to the microbiology department on the second floor, there's a. If you can see, there's a an area which has been separately designated for AIDS testing, and there's a pre-test counseling done. It's not like anyone who walks in and he can get this. There's a pre-test counseling which is done. Pre-test counseling means the person who is to be tested is counseled by a counselor about what test he is being done and what are the chances that he may have, and then what is to be done if it is positive. If the person is not willing to get the tested, and a consent is always taken. If it's an adult, if it's not an adult, means below 18 years, then the consent is given by the person's caregivers or parents or whosoever he is under the guardians. So it is not like a routine test where anyone can just walk in. So pre-test counseling is very, very important. Pre-test counseling and consent, and after that the testing is done, and complete privacy is maintained. These reports are not handed over to anyone else. They are handed over to the person only when he comes back for the next visit, and they are handed over personally to him only. And then they are, and in a sealed envelope, they are usually sent to the medical professional who is looking after this. They are not sent like openly. False positive, it has a high sensitivity rate of 99.5%, the ELISA test. False positivity rate is very low, and it is the negative is possible only during the incubation period when the person has been infected but has not yet developed the antibodies. So this ELISA test detects the antibodies of HIV, which we saw that the antibodies takes at least 10 to 12 weeks to develop. So in those 10 to 12 weeks after the infection, after the exposure, this is called as window period. And during this time, this ELISA test may be negative. So if you have a very high risk of suspicion that a person has had a very close exposure to a patient with HIV, like a needle prick or something, and you want to wait, then we usually get the test repeated after 12 weeks. And this ELISA test is usually confirmed by a Western blot test. So always two tests are done. First is ELISA and then a Western blot. And if required, which is not routine, but it is called PCR test, where the viral genome is detected. This is done after the confirmed diagnosis in patients to detect the complete load. It is called viral load. So testing for ELISA is for antibody. Testing for Western blot again is for antibody. PCR is done to detect the viral genome, that is the RNA levels. So this detects the copies of RNA inside the blood, which is called as viral load. So apart from these three tests, the fourth test is the CD4 levels. So CD4 level will tell you the level of the disease, the severity of the disease, and which stage of disease it is, and which type of opportunistic infections do we expect. So ELISA test, Western blot test are done to confirm the diagnosis. PCR test is done to know the stage of the disease and the grading of the disease, prognosis of the disease. Similarly, CD4 count is also done to find out at what stage of the disease is, how much the immunity has been suppressed, and again, which kind of drugs do we need to give it for prevention of the opportunistic infection. This will positive test indicates, it does not indicate disease. Virus may remain for 10 to 12 years without producing disease. Means, as we said, the asymptomatic phase of 10 to 12 years. So it doesn't mean that the patient is about to die or he's going to die very soon. It does not mean that. If the patient's overall health is fine, the patient may remain okay for around 10 to 12 years. The most important thing for a person diagnosed with a positive test is that he should not be transmitting it to other people. So he has to take precautions. Just like in COVID, we are these days saying that you wear masks. If everybody wears masks, then it is possible that the person who is asymptomatic but who is infected will not be transmitting the infection to others, which may happen while talking. Similarly, a person of HIV positive case who has still another 10 to 12 years in which he may remain asymptomatic. What is important for the person and for medical professional is to ensure that he does not become a source of spreading the disease. Is it? So the use of kind of protection is involved, and he kind of, but we have to maintain the privacy of the patient. We can't tell every other person that this person is HIV positive. So we have to make sure that his privacy is also ensured, and but he doesn't become a source of infection for others, whether it is his close family members, whether it is his wife, whether it is his people with whom he works. So these are kind of precautions which we have to take. Prevention is all about safe sex practice, use of condoms, control of STDs, screening of blood products, which was already doing, avoiding of pregnancy. Obviously, if a HIV positive person is married, ideally they should be told to avoid getting pregnant, because as we have seen, the risk of the child having HIV positive is very high, almost 90% positivity rate. So counseling is important. Antiretroviral therapy during pregnancy, they are quite effective. Breastfeeding, obviously, it's a controversial thing. In India, we encourage breastfeeding in most of the children because of lack of nutrition in otherwise. So treatment we will not be touching, and I think this should be the end of the lecture. Uh, my apologies for the delay in the start, because this was the first time where I was taking this lecture, and the quality of the slides again leads many questions that it was prepared a little hurriedly, and because the person was supposed to take, Dr. Sandeep, he was involved in uh, care of COVID patients, so he didn't have the time. So he requested me and asking that if I could take his lecture. The next lecture will be on Wednesday, same time, and it will be taken by me. You can expect slightly better quality of slides and presentation in that, which will be talking about the most important topic, which concerns us. Because then the patient comes to the hospital, he usually comes with the the opportunistic infections. Patients don't come to us with asymptomatic disease. Why will he come to a doctor with asymptomatic disease? He'll come to us when he develops these opportunistic infections. So it is these opportunistic infections which we have to know. Because in a hospital setup or a clinic setup, the person will come with opportunistic infection. So how to diagnose the opportunistic infections, how to suspect these opportunistic infection, and how to treat these opportunistic infection will be the topic of the next lecture. And I really don't know if there is any method of any queries, if you can, there is any question or something, so I can try to answer it. Just downloading your name of the presentation, so please remain online. Okay. So I'll just get the number of presentation and you can end the presentation. There is one question which has been asked by a student. Aryan Kharbanda, why is transmission low in cesarean section? The transmission is low because the maximum risk of transmission uh, happens during the labor. I don't know how many of you are aware that during labor there is a tearing down, and the mother tries to expel the child while from the uterus, and during that tearing down there is a lot of blood from the mother's side, from the uterus, which gets exchanged between the mother and the fetus. So the amount of blood moving through the placenta, that increases to very high levels. Now, if we do a cesarean section, this bearing down and this increasing pressure in the uterus, which causes the movement of blood across the placenta, it doesn't happen because there are no labor pains. So because when the labor pains happen, the patient bears down, there are uterine contractions, and this uterine contractions increases the chances of blood transmission through the placenta. But when there are no labor pains, there are no uterine contractions, and straight away a surgical incision is given and the baby is delivered out. So this phase of uh, uterine contractions leading to increased placental blood transmission is cut off. So that leads to a reduction in the chances of transmission of blood between the mother and the child. So this is how we have the reduction in the risk of uh, during the cesarean section. So although it is not officially recommended, but majority of the hospitals, whenever they deal HIV patients, they usually go in for cesarean section in patients who are on this thing. I hope that solves your query.